Topeka here at National Skills Coalition, and I'm really excited to be welcoming so many of you to today's webinar. We were just thrilled that more than 800 of you registered for today's session, which I think is a great indicator of the strong interest in the field in these issues. We will be hearing from 3 presenters on today's webinar, and I will be introducing each one of them. We're going to hold all questions until the end of the webinar, so if you have questions, you're welcome to type them into the chat box as they occur to you, and just be aware that we'll tackle them at the end of the webinar. We're going to go to the next slide now and just give a quick overview of today's webinar. We'll be hearing first an overview of opportunities under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, and then zooming in on a couple of examples, both examples of the practitioner side of adult education of people who are currently incarcerated, as well as examples around reentry programs for people who are leaving incarceration or have criminal records, and the policy issues at the state level in a couple of states. And then finally, we're going to share some resources from National Skills Coalition that may be helpful to those of you who are engaged in policy advocacy issues. Next slide. I'm really pleased that our first presenter is Sherry Moses from the Council of State Governments Justice Center. Sherry is a policy analyst in the Reentry and Employment Program at the Justice Center, and her work focuses on employer engagement, federal workforce policy, and correctional education. I know we always have a lot of practitioners on our webinars, so I'm happy to let you know that Sherry is one of you. She worked earlier in her career in providing education in Michigan prisons, in several different prisons, and she also developed the Illinois Reentry Employment Service Program, which helped more than 1,100 people who were formerly incarcerated find jobs in its first 18 months of operation. Sherry is also the person who this webinar really was the brainchild of. She approached me last year, and we put our heads together and developed this webinar. So we're very pleased that she's able to join us today. And Sherry, I'm going to ask that you unmute yourself and go ahead and take it away here.
Hello, and thank you to Amanda and the National Skills Coalition for inviting me to be on this webinar. Next slide, please. The Council of State Governments Justice Center is a national nonprofit and nonpartisan organization. We're mainly funded by the U.S. Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Assistance, and provide technical assistance to all Second Chance Act grantees. However, we also work on a number of specific project areas that are of interest to the field, and reentry and employment is one of these project areas. We house the National Reentry Resource Center, or the NRRC, through which we deliver training and technical assistance, have an online library of resources on a range of reentry issues, and also have monthly newsletters, including one specifically on reentry and employment. And I encourage you to sign up at the address on the screen. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with some background on the scope of incarceration and reentry in the United States. About 10 million people are released from prisons and jails each year. About 1 in 37 adults in the United States are under correctional control, and nationwide about 74 million adults have an arrest or conviction record. And we know that a criminal record impacts one's ability to find and maintain work. For example, in a 2015 poll, men with criminal records accounted for about 34% of all non-working men ages 25 to 54. Next slide, please. About 87% of employers now conduct criminal background checks, even though the information may be outdated or incorrect and may include arrests that never led to convictions. Employers are concerned about negligent hiring liability, and while some jobs certainly do require a background check, for many employers there's no duty to perform a criminal background check. Next slide, please. In 2012, the EEOC, or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, updated its guidelines on the use of criminal records in hiring decisions. So a blanket ban on hiring people with a criminal record is against the law. Employers must consider the type of offense, the time since the offense, and the job being considered. Many states, counties, and cities across the country have implemented fair chance hiring practices, such as ban the box. These policies vary from place to place. Some just cover public employees, and some cover private employees or government contractors as well. So ban the box policies typically refer to when you ask about a criminal record in the hiring process. We all know that if you can get your foot in the door, you have a better shot of getting the job. So ban the box policies take that box that asks about a criminal record off the initial application, but it may allow asking about a criminal record further along in the process, such as during an interview or after a conditional offer has been made. Next slide. The corrections and workforce development systems have their own goals, reducing recidivism for corrections and placing people in employment for workforce development. But because such a large percentage of the population has a criminal record, their goals overlap. Both systems prepare formerly incarcerated people for work, and both must make the most of limited time and resources. Next slide, please. The Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIOA, mentions ex-offenders, we prefer the term people with criminal records, as part of a list of people with barriers to employment, along with individuals with disabilities, people who are homeless, and others. So states were required to include an analysis of their current workforce and how they're going to address barriers to employment in their WIOA plans that were submitted about a year ago. I'm going to discuss 3 specific areas where WIOA can support the employment of adults with criminal records. Next slide, please. These areas are one-stop centers, also known as American Job Centers, correctional education, and special initiatives. Next slide, please. Most job seekers interact with WIOA through the one-stop centers that are located in communities across the country. Resources for the formerly incarcerated at one-stop centers may include staff with specialized training, such as the offender workforce development specialists that have been trained by the National Institute of Corrections. These staff are more prepared to assist job seekers with career planning and how to discuss a criminal record in a resume or a job interview. And like other one-stop staff, they also provide information on the work opportunity tax credit and the federal bonding program. Correctional reentry staff, such as probation and parole officers, regularly encourage their clients to obtain employment. The more they can refer clients to the one-stop services and work in partnership with the one-stop staff, the more likely they will see better employment outcomes. It's also important to make sure that the job centers encourage access for people with criminal records. For example, having brochures or signs aimed at people with criminal records in the one-stop resource room can let people know that they're welcome and that there are services for them. On the other hand, requiring identification or dress codes can actually reduce access to people with criminal records. Next slide, please. WIOA Title II, Adult Education and Literacy, Section 225, includes a requirement that states provide correctional education. And there are 8 allowable categories of service that are all listed on the slide. So those who follow National Skills Coalition closely know that integrated education and training and concurrent enrollment refers to combining occupational skills training and basic skills education. And career pathways refers to education and training that results in industry-recognized credentials and that help students advance over time. According to WIOA, not more than 20% of the funds available to the state for grants and contracts under Title II can be used for correctional education. This is actually up from 10% under WIA. WIOA correctional education funds are usually distributed by the state rather than through local workforce boards. Some states fund through the community college system, others through corrections or the public school system. Some states use a competitive grant process, but this isn't required. Next slide, please. As under WIOA, each governor can retain 15% of Title I funding for special initiatives and for statewide programs. Will's going to talk a little more about how these funds have been used in California, but I just want to mention a few general ideas about how the funds can be used. One example would be to expand programs for the formerly incarcerated that have been successful in one facility or local area throughout the state and to other areas across the state. A second example would be to adapt existing workforce strategies, such as subsidized employment, to the needs of people with criminal records. And the third example would be to test innovative strategies. Next slide, please. One example of testing a strategy would be to expand the integrated reentry and employment strategies, or IRIS model, developed by the Justice Center in a white paper that was released in 2013. The IRIS approach draws on research and best practices from both corrections and workforce development fields to ensure that people are connected to the most appropriate services at the right time in their reentry process. Next slide, please. The framework of the white paper is based heavily on R&R principles, or risk, need, and responsivity, to provide evidence-based guidance on who should be prioritized to receive interventions and to help determine what needs those interventions should address in order to reduce reoffending. So if we can assess risk, and by that I mean risk of recidivating, and job readiness needs on the front end, we can better connect people to the right types of services to meet their needs. So for example, a higher risk person returning from prison that has limited work experience and negative attitudes about legitimate employment should receive intensive structured services. In contrast, a lower risk person with a history of successful employment will benefit from minimal supervision and may need little assistance beyond writing a resume or reinstating a driver's license. The Justice Center is on the second year of a 3-year pilot testing IRIS in 2 sites, and those sites are Palm Beach County, Florida, and Milwaukee County, Wisconsin. The theory being tested is that by applying resources based on an assessment-driven referral process, recidivism and employment outcomes will improve. IRIS can be expanded to other communities using the 15% set aside. Next slide, please. Collaboration is key to reducing recidivism and to improving employment outcomes. The IRIS model also requires collaboration between workforce and corrections agencies so that assessment information can be shared and tests do not need to be repeated, using up valuable resources. It's important to share best practices in workforce, reentry, and corrections, such as cognitive behavioral interventions, transitional jobs, or integrated education models. And as I mentioned earlier, referral systems, especially between corrections and workforce, can save money and time and lead to better outcomes. Reentry task forces or other bodies are also a great way to get all of the key stakeholders and service providers at the same table. Next slide, please. In order to improve employment outcomes for people with criminal records, it's important to engage employers. With the employment rate now under 5%, employers are having difficulty finding workers, especially entry-level workers. And we're finding that they're much more open to considering people with criminal records. So when I speak to employers, they're often surprised and excited to hear about opportunities such as on-the-job training or the recruitment assistance that can be provided by one-stop centers. It's important to let employers know about the benefits and the legal requirements of hiring people with criminal records. Some of the benefits might include the training programs that are offered inside facilities across the country. And what employers have said is they found that a strong willingness to work on the part of people with criminal records. We've also found that chambers of commerce have been educating employers around the country about the benefits of hiring formerly incarcerated workers. And I strongly recommend that you reach out to your local chamber. So like all of us, we find that employers are most responsive to hearing information from their peers. If you have an employer who's had success hiring people with criminal records, ask them if they'd be willing to speak to other employers, either in their industry or through Chamber of Commerce meetings, about their experience. Next slide, please. So I'd like to encourage everyone to register for our monthly NRRC newsletter at csgjusticecenter.org/subscribe. And please feel free to contact me if you have further questions or would like to share some of your successes in using WIOA to serve people with criminal records. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Sherry. That was a tremendous amount of information and very useful. We did get several questions, but I just want to reiterate that we are sending the slides out today after the webinar. So for those of you who were really excited to see the slides and want to be able to have them to refer back to, you will have them. And we do see your questions coming in the question box. Thank you for submitting. We will be holding those until the end of the webinar to answer them for all of the presenters together. So now I'm happy to transition to our next presenter. Dr. Jillian Gabelman is the Curriculum and Instruction and Grants Facilitator as well as Tech Administrator. She's got many titles at Washburn Tech University. And so she's in Kansas. You're going to hear from her directly in just a minute about a really innovative correctional education program that she's working on that is sort of a springboard off of the IBEST model that some of you may be familiar with. But like many of us in the adult education world, she came in through the side door. That is, she had a career in a different field first. She has an undergraduate degree as well as master's and doctorate degrees in physics. So her background is in science. She also has expertise in developmental education and online learning. We're really pleased that Dr. Gabelman is able to join us today, and so I'm going to ask her to unmute herself and go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this webinar. I am excited to be able to talk about our program at Topeka Correctional Facility. We are proud of what we're doing at the facility and feel that for most of the women anyway, we are truly making a life-changing opportunity for them. To give you some background, Washburn Tech is a small technical college that is now affiliated with Washburn University. So, and Washburn University is the only four-year municipal university left, I believe, in the nation. And it's located in Topeka, which is the capital of Kansas, of course. The facility is the only women's, next slide please. The facility is the only women's facility in the state, and the population is about 860 women. They're housed in two compounds. The larger compound is the low to medium facility called the central unit, and the IJ unit is the maximum high medium that includes the segregation area. We have been fortunate to be able to offer programming on both sides. So we served over 330 women in the last 2.5 years. We teach about 20 women per cohort on the central side, the lower custody side, and we have a smaller space, so we have 12 women at a time on the maximum side. And we've also been able to use the graduates of the program to come back into the class as tutors, which is also a good growing experience for them. To have that opportunity to teach somebody what you know always reinforces that information. So the program has been funded by 2 grants. The first from the Justice Department, which actually the Kansas Department of Commerce was the grantee, and we were the educational trainer. And in the second grant, Washburn is the grantee, and we are partnering with the Topeka Correctional Facility, the Department of Commerce, and Greenbush, who is the contracted provider for adult education at the facility. We're in an interesting situation where on the low side is where Greenbush works, and then we are also able to offer some GED instruction ourselves on the other side, where they're they are not working. So it's an interesting juggling between partners, which is always fun. Could we go to the next slide, please? Okay, I'll talk a little more about accelerating opportunities later on. As many of you are aware, preparing the incarcerated for release has many facets, and we believe it's critical that education and training is a part of that. As Sherry said, it's an important piece that they get some credentials while they're coming out. And we have an interesting situation in the prison because it's the only women's prison. Many of the women are not there for very long, and so the reentry team, I think, it struggles with the logistics. Again, it reflects what Sherry said about the too much to do with too few resources. So we do try hard to work with the facility staff to add this program to their release plan. They are told about the program when they come through the entry process, RDU, and they're also TABE tested at that time. So that, and then we can determine whether or not they have, then we find out whether or not they have a GED. So we know some background of the women, but of course, when you go into the education model, we have to be sure that they can succeed. So we retest them with the TABE test before they start. We generally use their initial TABE test to screen the applicants, and then if they don't have a GED, for sure, we retest them before we start them in our program so that we know exactly what their TABE scores are. Some students we found are successful if they enter directly into the concurrent program, where they are both placed in technical training and in adult education studies. But we found that others really need to improve their basic skills first. They find it overwhelming to be trying to improve on math and reading skills at the same time as they're trying to study the technical information. So the program has gone from being 8 to 10 weeks long with the first grant, when we were required only to serve students who had a GED. Under the IRE grant, we are serving those, primarily serving those who do not have a GED. And so we have gone from an 8 to 10 week program to a full-length semester program. Next slide, please. Excuse me. I think it's important to understand where the incarcerated population is, and also where our students at PCF relate to that, and was really pleased when the data came from the PIAC, when the data from the PIAC study was recently released. If you're not familiar with this data, it is a very interesting study that looks at the educational attainment and other things of inmates compared to the U.S. household. And so what I pulled from this data to share with you today is the number of those who have do not have a high school diploma. And you can see that for the U.S. household populations, that's the first line of that chart, it's 14% for U.S. household. Generally for inmates, it is 30%. At TCF, we're running at about 46%. And I think one of the other things that is striking about this is that on average, women inmates have lower skills than men. If you look at literacy scores, interestingly enough, there's not much difference between the general inmate population and the U.S. households. And I was wondering when I was looking at this data if that's because reading is one of the things that the inmates spend a lot of time doing. On the with TCF, though, again, as we've tested the women that we are serving, and this is not all of TCF, this is the sample that we are serving, so it's not a huge sample, we found that 49% have low literacy skills. This is measured on the TABE test, whereas the PIAC study was using their own scale. So their lower literacy is below a level 2. Then with numeracy skills, we see that generally the numeracy skills, even for those with a high school diploma, are lower than those of the normal U.S. household. And that's exactly what we have found. Even if the students have a GED, they have low basic skills. So next slide, please. So the program that we are offering out there is the technical side of it is the Certified Production Technician that leads to a credential through MSSC. It consists of 4 courses: safety, process, quality, and maintenance awareness. We also teach them OSHA 10 and forklift certification. So at the end of the program, a successful student will have 14 hours of college credit and several certifications. They get a certification for each of the CPT classes, but if they complete all of the 4 certifications, they then become a certified production technician. This is one of the institution's 7 AOK pathways. And AOK is our model of IBEST. It came to Kansas in 2010 through a state grant that we were a part of, and we have, over the course of the time, developed 7 pathways, as I said. The CPT is part of our advanced manufacturing pathway. What is powerful, I believe, about the IBEST model is the way it blends the basic skills and GED preparation with technical skills. You have that overlap of teaching between the technical instructor and the GED instructor, and they share the same classroom. We only have 1 classroom, so there's a lot of that overlap in what we are doing. And then you also have some case management of the participants. We've been successful with the program. We've had over a 90% graduation rate. The wages of the women who have exited and found jobs has ranged from $10 to $16 an hour, and some have been as high as $20 an hour. We have several that have gone on to do 4-year degrees and or enrolled in other technical programs here at Washington Tech. Next slide, please. An important part, we believe, of working with the women is to help them also with their soft skills. So embedded in the program from the very beginning was a job readiness coach. Many of these women have never had a real job in the free world, and so it's important to help them through their communication skills, their team building skills, helping them write a resume, their conviction statement. We put them through mock interviews, and the job readiness coach is the one that also does the case management. In the last year, we've added another piece to the curriculum that I really am excited about, called the Work Ethics Curriculum, which comes from the Center for Work Ethic Development in Denver. And it talks about bring your A game to work. And if you're not familiar with this curriculum, the A game talks about the 7 A's: acceptance, appearance, accountability, attendance, attitude, ambition. And I have accountability in my list twice, so I've missed something today. That's annoying. Anyway, there are 7 of them. So we have found that this really resonates with the women. Many of them have never thought about, what does it mean if I'm not there? You know, what does that mean for an employer? And so to help them think through those is very interesting, I think, and very helpful. And the person that we have going out to teach that has been super in working with the women, and she's got so involved with working with the women, I think she's going to sign up to be a mentor, so that's always a win-win. We've also found that we have added new topics for discussion, including the dangers and pitfalls of dating in the workplace, because those are some of the things they have probably never thought through before. And then the last piece that I want to talk about today is the alternative workforce specialist. This is a position that who is employed by the Department of Commerce and the Department of Corrections, and she works with several of the institutions across the state, but she is our liaison that between the workforce centers and our students, because of course being the only state, the only women's prison, our women release across the state. And then she's also working with and identifying those employers that are felon friendly. And she has had regional meetings with employers to discuss the work, the skills that the women have as they come out. And she works with several other prisons across the state, not just our women. But this has been a huge advantage for us and a great bridge for the women as they come out to get them enrolled in their local workforce center and to be able to work with those people. And often she goes and introduces them to whoever's they're going to be their case person in the workforce center. So it's worked really well. And with that, I will say thank you. Next slide.
Great. All right. Thank you so much. We very much appreciate your presentation, and we've been getting lots of comments and questions in the question box, so keep those coming, and we'll get to those at the end of the webinar. But I do want to say thank you to Jessie Kremer, who says that the 7 words are attitude, attendance, appearance, ambition, accountability, acceptance, and appreciation. So thank you for that missing word getting supplied there. So I'm happy now to introduce our third presenter, Will Heaton. Will is the Director of Policy and Public Affairs for the Center for Employment Opportunities, and he manages CEO's public policy initiatives and works to engage public officials at all levels of government. He comes out of the philanthropic world and has also worked on the Hill with a previous experience at the Council on Foundations, as well as serving as Chief of Staff for an Ohio congressman. So we're very pleased to have Will. He's going to talk first about CEO and their model for helping people with criminal records to find employment after incarceration. And then he's going to talk about a couple of state examples where CEO has worked at the policy level to engage around some of those exact levers that Sherry was talking about in her comments when she said there's the WIOA 15% set-aside funds, and there are the other mechanisms in WIOA. So Will, I'm going to turn it over to you. Oops, you may need to unmute yourself, Will. We're not hearing you.
There we go. Thank you very much. Thank you, Amanda, for that, and thank you everyone for your time today. Really appreciate it. Next slide, please. So as Amanda was saying, the Center for Employment Opportunities, or more commonly known by our acronym just CEO, is a national nonprofit organization that works with formerly incarcerated individuals to help connect them to the workforce and then stay connected to the workforce over the longer term in achieving long-term career pathways. And we serve approximately 5,000 individuals a year now across 6 states, with a few more states probably coming online over the course of this year. So what I'll do is just take a few minutes to really explain how we operate and the type of individuals that we serve, and then can speak specifically about how we work very closely with the workforce development system in a couple of the states where we operate. So next slide, please. So first, just a quick overview of the average participant that it comes to CEO is usually somebody that's more recently released from incarceration, mostly from state correctional facilities. And they have an average usually of about a 7th to 8th grade education in math and reading skills, have multiple felony counts oftentimes, and little with any work experience. And 45, 47% of our participants are young adults, ages 18 to 25. And CEO's program is set up to serve these type of individuals that fit many of these characteristics that are often assessed with a much higher risk to recidivate, and are oftentimes not as effectively served by a lot of other systems. And that's a large reason why CEO's program, that I'll talk to in a minute, is such an intensive program. And that's very important. I think I just wanted to reiterate something that Sherry had said at the top of the webinar when she was talking about the risk, need, and responsivity and sort of those assessments and the risk assessment and where somebody is in those risk factors in terms of recidivating, ensuring that any type of workforce or educational training that provided to them or they're connected to is delivered with the appropriate dosage, because it can oftentimes work against an individual's success if the dosage or the type of treatment isn't well aligned with what their needs are. And so for CEO, we're very specific to working with individuals that are a much higher risk to recidivate oftentimes, and it's oftentimes, characteristics that an individual has that are not as effectively served within the workforce system, because a lot of services that are provided aren't tailored to address some of the needs that they have. And so the way that our program works is that, everyone that comes to CEO is usually referred to us by their parole or probation officer, and then they're enrolled in a 1-week orientation course where we're working with them to, grab the necessary identification so that they are employable, such as a driver's license, Social Security, birth certificate. And then working with them over the course of that week about setting expectations for what they should anticipate when they are going on to a work site and being in a more formal work environment. And upon completion of that orientation, we actually hire each of these individuals on as our own employees. And they become employees within a transitional work program that we operate at each of our sites. And the way that that transitional work program operates is that 3 to 4 days a week, each of these individuals reports to a work site. They work about 7 to 8 hours a day on a crew of about 5 to 7 individuals. And then at the end of each day, they're assessed on a number of different performance metrics, such as timeliness and attendance, how well you've worked with other coworkers on that work crew, how well you've worked with your supervisor in taking direction or kind of different types of constructive criticism in terms of how your job performance can be improved. And then we also pay each individual at the end of the day so that they're not having to grapple with, going a week or 2 weeks, from paycheck to paycheck, as is oftentimes the case with normal payroll cycles. And it really provides a much more steady, stabilizing just source of income as they're acclimating and reintegrating back into the workforce. And then one additional day each week, in addition to that transitional job, they're coming to our offices where they have a job coach who essentially is serving as a case manager, but working with them on interviewing skills, building a resume, helping them navigate how they can talk about a felony conviction in an interview with a potential employer, and really just helping them build the confidence and some of the conversational and other soft skills that are going to be so essential for them to be able to succeed in a workplace environment. And each individual moves through the program at their own pace, and so when we hit a status that we like to call Job Start Ready, they transition to another group of staff within our organization called Business Account Managers. And what this group of staff is doing is constantly doing outreach into the local business community, identifying employers who have labor force needs, and then we're matching up our participants with those employers, and they're going in to interview. And then each of our clients or participants, they have to present themselves on their own, and sell themselves to the employer as to why they would be a good fit. But all of the transitional work and job coaching that they've had over the past few months has really put them in a position to be very successful. And we have a really good placement rate with a lot of our employers. A lot of them, I'd say probably 80% or more, are small businesses who have really come to look at CEO as a very specialized staffing agency and can help them address some of the HR needs that those local businesses have, where, obviously running a successful business but don't have the additional capacity or revenue to support a full HR function. And then what we do is once somebody has been placed in an unsubsidized job, they're assigned another staff member on the CEO team called a retention specialist who stays connected with them over the course of the next year to help them navigate any other barriers that they're most likely going to encounter as they're in that job. So whether that's housing, accessing health care, working with their parole officer, any type of substance abuse meetings or treatments that they're required to attend, but just making sure that they have a support system and an advocate that as they are reintegrating and becoming increasingly acclimated to the workforce, they have somebody that can really help guide them. Because oftentimes, having been incarcerated, and in many cases for longer periods of time, that adjustment, even after a year, can be extremely stressful. And formerly incarcerated individuals have some very unique barriers that require different types of attention in terms of how we can navigate those. So that's essentially the CEO model. So next slide, please. And one thing that we're just very, very focused on within our organization as well, and I think many of you that work within or for the workforce system can appreciate this as well, is evidence and being able to report data on a regular basis. And so we have subjected ourselves to several outside third-party evaluations over the course of our history that have really shown that the model and the way that we operate it can reduce recidivism. And we're singularly focused on doing that through the employment and connection to the workforce. But also, in addition to being able to reduce recidivism and the number of days that individuals may be spending in jail or prison, is also just the cost-benefit analysis. And down there in that bottom right part of the slide, just showing that some of these studies have shown that for every dollar spent on our program, it can actually save $3.30 in cost savings in terms of reducing corrections costs or other service entities within government systems. Next slide, please. So as I had said at the start, we're a national organization, and this is just a quick overview of all of the different locations where CEO currently works. And so for many of you that are in any of these states, happy to follow up or talk separately if there's further interest in how, of the local workforce board official or somebody else at a one-stop, center would be interested in potentially partnering us, especially if this slice of the population is increasingly part of your planning moving forward, especially since people with convictions have been identified in WIOA as one of the priority service populations. But two states that I want to particularly call out now in terms of how CEO works very, very closely with the workforce system are Pennsylvania and California. And so next slide, please. So in Pennsylvania, and there may be some of you from Pennsylvania on the phone, so I want to at the outset give a big shout out to the workforce and the labor and industry, department there in the state, because I think they've done a tremendous job in really being forward-looking in how they came together to draft the state's workforce plan. And so CEO has been operating in Philadelphia for a couple of years. We just started up a second operation at the end of last year in Pittsburgh, and later this year we'll be in Harrisburg as well. But one of the reasons for our ability to kind of scale successfully in Pennsylvania has been being able to partner with the workforce system there. And when the state was developing its state WIOA plan, they had representatives from many different departments across the government at the table doing that, but also including the Department of Corrections. And having that Department of Corrections presence there really allowed them to fold in different types of recommendations and policies about how they could serve the formerly incarcerated population, or just individuals that may not have been incarcerated but have some type of criminal history. And from that, then some of those recommendations were then obviously passed down to the local workforce boards. But one of them that's been most, I think, useful for CEO, given its model and many other nonprofits, was that in the federal legislation, there was a recommendation that workforce boards could use up to 10% of their funding for transitional work programs, which is the core of CEO's model, for example. And Pennsylvania, when it wrote its state plan, actually took that recommendation a state further and said that it was going to make that a requirement, and that local workforce boards needed to set aside up to 10% of Title I funding for transitional work programs, knowing that it could be a very useful bridge in terms of moving people into unsubsidized work over time. And so a lot of the local workforce boards then in turn, not necessarily having run transitional work programs previously, started to reach out to local service providers issuing RFPs. And so the Workforce Board in Allegheny County around Pittsburgh, we have a partnership with them where we have a grant from them using some of the Title I funds to help support the transitional work program. And we're going to have a similar partnership with the South Central Workforce Board outside of Harrisburg coming up in the later part of this year to do a similar thing. But I think it's just a great example of, and I know there's many other states around the country that are creating opportunities for similar types of partnerships where the workforce system can work much more cohesively with the nonprofits to deliver more tailored services for different slices of a population that have more unique barriers. So the next slide, please. And then in California, where CEO has been operating for about 6+ years now, there's also a couple of unique opportunities that we've been able to take advantage of here as well. As Sherry had said in her presentation, every governor has a certain amount of set-aside funds under WIOA that they can use for their discretion. And so in California, they have a program through using some of the governor's discretionary funds with the State Workforce Board that provide accelerator grants to different counties and nonprofits that want to partner with different counties. And they're focused on different target populations. But what we've been able to do is apply, and working with a couple of community colleges, apply for some of these accelerator grants. And then in our San Bernardino office, for example, we have a great partnership with the community college where they're actually the one that manages the grant, but we provide our transitional work model, and then they, within their curriculum development, have created certain short-term competency-focused certification courses that we can send our participants to that help them gain certain, early entry or more entry-level certifications, but helps them become more competitive in the workforce. And the community college has been able to use some of this funding to ensure that they can offer those courses at times that work around, different individuals' work schedules so that they can fit this into their, kind of day-to-day schedules more seamlessly and not, have to disrupt what their employment may be, especially given that it can be so hard for them to find employment, and they're going to forego training oftentimes if it's that versus being their job at the end of the day. And I think a second thing then that's also been great within California working with the State Workforce Board is a few years ago, the legislature, with the governor's support, passed what is called Assembly Bill 2060. And what it basically did is took some funding out of the State Recidivism Reduction Fund and moved it to the State Workforce Board. And the State Workforce Board then used that funding to basically as matching grants with counties who were willing to put up their funding to specifically provide workforce training programs for people that were on probation in those counties and under community supervision to have a more specific, dedicated funding stream for returning citizens to help them gain or reconnect or connect to the first time into the workforce. And so for organizations like CEO and others across the state of California, it's provided us another great opportunity to really work not just with state workforce boards, but the local ones at the county level, and align our services with their own goals, and oftentimes even help deliver certain services as opposed to them having to stand up or create their own services within their own system. So those are just a couple of examples. Definitely a lot of other innovative things happening in many states around the country, but those are two that I often like to highlight just because of how well it's been able to, the workforce systems and the nonprofits such as ourselves have been able to align our services to serve this population so much more effectively. And I will conclude there.
Great. Thank you so much, Will, and thank you to all of our presenters. And thank you to all of you who've joined us today. We have such a wonderful variety of questions. We're going to do a couple things here. I'm going to first do a rapid-fire round of questions to our presenters of things that are very quick answers that I think they'll be able to sort of say yes or no to. And there may be one or two where they're going to want to follow up with you individually after the webinar. So the first question is for you, Jillian, which is, has the model that you discussed for the women's program ever been tried with male correctional inmates?
Yes, Barton County Community College is doing it at Ellsworth in Kansas.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Second question is for you, Sherry, and that is with regard to the map that you showed about the 26 states that have policies that are sort of similar to ban the box or something like that. The question is, of the map shows states that have policies covering private employers and other states that have policies covering public employers. And the question is, are the states that cover public employers, does that also include private, or are those separate? It's not quite clear, I guess, from the map whether there are states that have both public and private employers covered.
It really varies, and I could probably send out a more specific list.
Great. Well, thank you, Sherry, and we'll include that in the resources that we send out after today's webinar is over. Okay, so next question is with regard to your program again, Jillian. You talked about how you work with MSSC regarding the credential. I think it's for the Certified Production Technician credential that you all have your participants earning. Can you talk about what's the importance of working with them for your program? How does that help a program of this nature?
Okay, the MSSC is the Manufacturing Skills Standards Council, and what they do is they offer the credential. And so the women take a test online at the end of their course, and they have to achieve a certain score in order to be able to get the credential. And so if they achieve that score, then they get a certificate that says they have the safety credential or the quality credential. And so what that does for the women is it gives them something on their resume, and it gives them an opportunity it gives them the knowledge that they need to step into a modern manufacturing plant and be able to be a productive worker.
Great. And I would just add also, for a bigger picture perspective as well, third-party credentials can be valuable because they are portable from employer to employer, and they are a sort of, if you will, neutral and objective way of demonstrating skills and competencies. So that's really important.
Absolutely, and nationally as well.
Sorry, yeah.
And also nationally important.
I'm sorry, nationally, yes, thank you. Question for you, Will. Is the CEO model funded under WIOA via youth programs or adult or both?
Right now, we are funded just solely through the adult programs because we don't serve anybody that is younger than 18 years old, but they may be able to use youth funding with other nonprofits in a very similar fashion.
Okay. And another question for you, Will. Do CEO participants exit your course with a kind of credential? We were just hearing about the credential that folks leave Jillian's program with. Do folks leave CEO with a credential?
They do. We offer a wide range of credentials and either, have a lot of partnerships with credential training partners. So everybody at all of our sites has the opportunity to leave with OSHA 10, and then in some sites credentials, well above and beyond that. A lot of places, forklift operator. We have several credentials in the food services industry, hospitality industry. And then we're increasingly focused on partnering with organizations like Jobs for the Future, that has a lot of experience in this field about how we can just further enhance that credential because, as has been referenced on this call, those are so important in terms of, laying the groundwork for a more successful career pathway and longer-term job retention.
Great. Jillian, two questions for you about curriculum. One is a clarifying question. Is the Bring Your A Game curriculum from Michael Santos? Is that the person who produced the curriculum? And then the
that
second
sounds
thing
familiar.
Is,
yes, I believe
okay.
So.
And the second thing is teacher certification required for the A Game curriculum? Is it easy to do for a person with adult education experience?
I'm not sure the answer to that. I believe she attended a workshop that was put on by the Center for Work Ethic Development. So, yes, There's some training required, not necessarily a credential.
Okay, that's very helpful.
And
so
that actually also, they get a certificate with that as well. So that's another thing that adds to their resume.
The participants get a certificate for
Yes.
having participated
Yes.
in that curriculum. Great.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
So we had another question that's sort of general, and I'll leave it open to any of the three of you, but a question about the availability of adult education programs for people who are in local jails, that is not convicted and serving time in prison, but are simply in jail awaiting trial or because they can't make bail or something like that. Are any of you familiar with programs that are serving people in local jails?
Yeah, in Topeka, the local jail is served by the community adult education center. And I don't know much on details, but I do know they are in there serving that population.
Great. Will or Sherry, do you want to jump in on this question as well, or no?
Sure.
I think it just varies around the country.
Mm-hmm.
The degree of like education and training that's offered in jails.
Yeah, I mean, in CEO's case, you know, I think that Sherry was saying it depends on the different states, but like in California, where we definitely work with individuals, coming back from the jail population, definitely, being able to help them in terms of gaining employment after time served in jail as opposed to prison is something. And so I think it's, the opportunity is definitely there. It's just looking at what the local or state laws are and kind of how the workforce system can just align with the corrections system and what, supervisory services, those individuals are having to report under.
Great. Another question for you, Will. Does your model include partnerships with labor unions, or does it place formerly incarcerated people in apprenticeships?
So we definitely work with labor unions. In California, for example, we have a great training partnership with the Teamsters, and that's been very promising so far over the last, we just started about 6 to 8 months ago, I would say. But definitely looking at where we can develop those types of training partnerships in other places around the country, especially given the types of jobs that labor unions provide a pathway towards. And then apprenticeships is definitely something else that we are focused on. A lot of the participants that we serve aren't at a point yet where they're as prepared to be successful in a more formal apprenticeship program. But what we do have is, in our New York City location, for example, a partnership with one of the community colleges that provides a 12-week carpentry and related skills training and certification course. And then what has happened in many cases is graduates of that course have been able to join an apprenticeship track program with the local carpenters union. And, we have some great success stories there. So we're a little bit oftentimes working at the earlier end of the, the continuum, but definitely the aim is to have that serve as a track into those types of apprenticeships, and are working with different officials at the Federal Department of Labor as the apprenticeship programs, continue to gain support in terms of how we can sort of identify more formal apprenticeship training programs and where we can integrate our services as part of those.
Great. So we're going to do just 2 more questions, and then we have a couple of resources that I'd like to share with those of you who are working on these issues at a policy level. The first question is with regard to services for people who are incarcerated or people who are in reentry who are also military veterans. Jillian, I'll go to you first. Is there any specific aspect of your program that is identifying or in any way working with veterans? And then, Will, I'll go to you.
I don't think specifically we have identified that as a group. I mean, we don't turn anybody away. We would encourage, but I don't believe we have any specific services that we have done at the moment.
Okay, and Will?
Yes, I mean, at CEO, we definitely, work with and serve veterans. I think that there's, the way that our program is set up is because there is, a very specific one-on-one focus. that we don't sort of, have a veteran portfolio where they're sort of separated or treated differently. But, our staff definitely, are trained in cognitive behavioral intervention, motivational interviewing, and definitely, as we work with different veterans, that with some of the unique barriers that they have, are taking those into account. We're trying to help them navigate along their career trajectories.
Okay. So
And
last
Amanda,
question for each. I'm sorry, go ahead.
This is Sherry. Just from my days working for the state of Illinois, I know that the veteran staff that are in the one-stops do receive training on working with incarcerated veterans. And the Department of Veterans Affairs, at least back a few years ago, was offering some programs on incarcerated veterans.
Great. Well, that's a good resource for folks to look into. So I'm going to ask one final question of the panelists, and then we'll present the resource slides, and we'll wrap up because we're at time here. But the last question is sort of a strategic question. We've gotten several different varieties of this, which is basically how do you advocate within the WIOA structure, whether it's with your local workforce board or your state agency, both to encourage that up to that 20% of adult ed funds is actually spent on corrections, but also to encourage local workforce boards to think about funding services specifically for people who are reentering. In other words, how do you speak up about these issues? How do you advocate on these issues with folks for whom this is not their daily work, whether they are in the adult education or workforce side at local or state policy levels? So Sherry, I'm going to go to you first, and then I'm going to go to Jillian, and then Will, and then we'll do the last couple of slides.
Actually, I find that even for the workforce staff who have no special interest or engagement with people with criminal records, that they're finding they are serving people with backgrounds, and that a sizable number of people that come into the one-stops have a criminal history. And so they're kind of reaching out more, looking for ways to learn how to serve them better.
Okay, great. Jillian?
And I think we find at the ground force, at the workforce level, they are engaged. We have a lot of the same title that Kathy has, alternative workforce specialists, that work both in the one-stops and also work for the state. So I think there is a lot of awareness in Kansas. I'm not sure in terms of the funding, though, that the funding is being set aside. So that is, I think that's an excellent question that I need to probably think through myself a little more deeply so that I can start advocating for that.
All right, and Will, as a public policy person, go for it.
I think there's 2 points that I would say. I mean, I think first, the workforce development system and workforce boards, a large part of that role is to help businesses, identify the workforce that's going to be able to fill those skilled positions that they need to keep the economy churning. And so especially given in this tight labor market, the number of individuals that have been incarcerated, but even more so just the number of Americans that have some type of criminal record, this is a population from which, employers are going to have to draw. And, and so I think, the workforce systems being able to recognize that and being very open to helping businesses kind of think about how they can, draw from that talent pool. The second thing I would say, though, more specifically to the policy and the legislation is, under WIOA when it was passed, these sort of reprioritization, and identifying these much more specific priority service populations, individuals with criminal records were definitely identified in there. And as the Department of Labor sort of, was recalibrating, this regression model that they use to assign different weights to sort of the labor market strength in each area, different workforce board areas around the country, but then also the types of characteristics that individuals would have that are going to be served through the workforce system. Like for instance, there was a little bit more weight assigned to a criminal conviction. I think there could still be more done there. just given how hard they can be placed, but it gave a little bit more flex for the workforce boards at the state and ultimately the local level to try to identify ways that they could serve these higher priority populations and not be penalized by the performance metrics that they're held accountable to as the Federal Department of Labor is looking at how they need to look at those, measurements and allow some more flexibility within the workforce system. And so with a lot of the workforce boards that we partner with, we've, definitely talked about that because we understand the pressure that the workforce boards are under to hit those measurements, or they could face sanctions and lose funding. And we're saying, work with an organization like us that has good success and evidence in successfully placing these individuals, and we can help you work towards those metrics, and not face any type of sanction situation.
Great. All right, we're going to go to the next slide now. So National Skills Coalition is available to help you. We have technical assistance available for free for advocates who are trying to advance policies. So if you want to work on the issue of getting increased funding in your state adult education funding stream to support corrections education, if you want to support additional funding for workforce development for people reentering. If you go to the next slide here, you'll see that we have a range of different ways we can help you identify policies in other states or localities. We can help you draft policy, including language. We can help you with coalition building or strategic communications if you need to get an op-ed in the newspaper, something like that. On the next slide, you'll see some of the printed publications that we have available. There are some policies, and you heard today about Jillian's program that uses integrated education and training approach. We have a scan that shows each state that has a statewide policy on IET. There are lots of other states that have individual programs, but this is a focus on states that have statewide policies. We also have a toolkit, as you'll see on the next slide, showing how your state can implement such a policy, what does a model policy look like, and what a sample legislative template is. We're happy to talk to you individually about these publications. And as you'll see in the next slide, we also have some publications around adult education, and particularly around the need for adult education to help move people into good middle-skill jobs that can pay family wages. And again, we're happy to talk with you about how you can use these materials in your advocacy with policymakers, with journalists, with other stakeholders in the field. So I encourage you to reach out to National Skills Coalition if you have questions. The last thing I'll say is you'll be getting an email from us in about an hour with the slides, the recording, and a link to a survey about this webinar. So please take just 2 minutes of your time and answer our survey. It will really help us to learn more about how we can improve our webinars in the future. Thanks for your patience. I apologize we went a bit over time, but we had so many of your wonderful questions. I think we wanted to get to as many as we could. Have a great rest of your afternoon.